Think you've seen every horror movie ever made? Think again. Some films never made it out of the vault, not because they were bad, but because they weren't meant to be seen. In the vast catacombs of cinema history, there exists a darker archive films that were shot in full, edited, sometimes even screened once, and then disappeared. Shelved by studios, abandoned by directors, lost to legal limbo, or buried beneath scandal, these movies became phantoms. Some were deemed too disturbing. Others were victims of corporate collapse, rights disputes, or simply bad timing. But all share one chilling common thread. They were completed, and then they vanished. There are whispers of reels rotting in forgotten warehouses, of VHS copies passed hand to hand like cursed artifacts, of scenes so bizarre they seem to infect the editing room itself. A few titles resurfaced decades later, fragmented, altered, or incomplete, only to leave more questions than answers. Others remain missing, known only through secondhand accounts and faded production stills. This isn't about lost ideas. This is about films that were born, lived, and then were buried. So tonight, we unseal the canisters, dust off the reels, and descend into the archive of the abandoned. Let's dive right into the darkness. 1. London After Midnight, 1927. It's the holy grail of lost horror, and it might be gone forever. Starring Lon Chaney in a dual role and directed by Todd Browning, Dracula, London. After Midnight was once a cornerstone of silent-era horror. It told the story of a mysterious vampire-like figure haunting a London estate and featured Chaney in one of the most iconic makeup designs of all time. Sharp teeth, hypnotic eyes, and a sinister top hat. But in 1965, the last known print was destroyed in an MGM vault fire. What followed was decades of speculation. Was the film overrated? Was it truly terrifying? Could another copy exist somewhere, misfiled or mislabeled in a foreign archive? Despite years of searching, no complete version has ever been found. In 2002, Turner Classic Movies recreated it using production stills and the original script, but the soul of the film remains locked in the ashes. It is, to this day, the most famous lost horror film in history. And sometimes, the most terrifying horror movie is the one you'll never get to watch. 2. Grizzly 2. The Predator, shot 1983, released 2020. It had Charlie Sheen, George Clooney, and Laura Dern, and no one ever saw it. Grizzly 2 was meant to be the ambitious sequel to the surprise hit Grizzly 1976, a nature-run-amok horror flick about a giant bear on a rampage. Filmed in Hungary in 1983, it featured young, pre-fame versions of Sheen, Clooney, and Dern, and then vanished before it was ever finished. Why? A perfect storm of bad luck. The producer fled the country with the money. The animatronic bear malfunctioned. Permissions were revoked mid-shoot. The footage, partially edited, was locked away for decades in storage. For nearly 40 years, the film lived as a rumor. Bootleg clips surfaced at conventions. Horror magazines ran features about the cursed bear movie no one finished. Then, in 2020, it was finally stitched together using the original footage and released. The result was a strange, patchy, and oddly hypnotic relic of 80 seconds horror ambition gone terribly wrong. Grizzly 2 isn't just about what's on screen. It's about everything that went wrong before it could be seen. 3. Begotten, 1989. There is no dialogue, no clear plot, just agony on celluloid. Begotten opens with a god disemboweling himself, and somehow, it only gets worse. Directed by Elias Merhige, this experimental horror film is a mythological fever, dream of birth, decay, and rebirth, all depicted through grotesque, flickering black and white imagery that feels ancient and diseased. The film was completed in 1989, screened at festivals, and then vanished into obscurity. Why? Most likely because no one knew what to do with it. Distributors were horrified, critics were baffled, viewers walked out. Merhige claimed the film was meant to function like a dream you can't wake from, and that's exactly what it became, a cinematic ritual that repelled the mainstream. Only decades later did it resurface, thanks to bootlegs and midnight screenings. Still, its original negative is deteriorating, and few high-quality versions exist. Begotten doesn't ask to be understood, it asks to be survived. 4. The Poughkeepsie Tapes, 2007. It was made, then banned, then whispered about. The Poughkeepsie Tapes is a found-footage horror mockumentary that pretends to chronicle the life of a serial killer through his own home videos. The film was completed by MGM in 2007 and scheduled for wide release. Trailers even played in theaters. Then, silence. At the last minute, MGM pulled the release without explanation. No theatrical run, no DVD, just radio silence. Rumors flew. Too disturbing, too realistic, too much like a real case. For years, the film circulated only in bootleg DVDs and torrents, its reputation growing as an underground snuff film. When it finally got a proper release in 2017, it was still jarring, choppy, cold, and clinically terrifying. But many still believe that the version we see is incomplete, trimmed, softened. When a movie feels too real, studios pull the plug, and sometimes that only makes it feel more real. 5. The Other Side of the Wind, 1,970 seconds, 2018. It took over 40 years for the film to surface, and even now, it doesn't feel real. While not horror in the traditional sense, The Other Side of the Wind is a cursed artifact in cinematic history and in its rawest moments, far more disturbing than most genre films. Orson Welles shot the film in the 1,970 seconds as a mockumentary satire hybrid exploring the final days of a fictional director, only for his real life to mirror the story in unsettling ways. The film was completed, but then entangled in decades of legal battles, political turmoil, including the Iranian Revolution, and vanished finances. The footage sat in a Paris vault for decades, decaying, while cinephiles debated whether it even existed. When it was finally reconstructed and released in 2018 with Netflix's help, what emerged was beautiful, broken, and laced with existential dread. Part satire, part fever dream, part confessional from beyond the grave. The horror isn't in monsters or murder, it's in decay, legacy, and watching a genius confront the void. Sometimes, a film isn't lost because it disappeared. It's lost because time made it unrecognizable. 6. Night of the Demon, 1,957. The Full Curse. The truth isn't what you see on screen. It's what they cut out. Night of the Demon is widely praised as one of the most influential supernatural horror films of the 1,950 seconds. But the version most audiences know isn't the one its director, Jacques Tourneur, intended. The original cut was longer, subtler, and kept the demonic entity off-screen, relying on suggestion and dread. But after studio interference, the film was recut, and a literal demon was inserted in the opening and climax. Tourneur was furious. Critics were divided, and the studio buried the original cut. To this day, that original version without the demon remains lost. Some believe reels still exist in studio archives. Others think they were destroyed deliberately. Sometimes, the scariest thing is what was never meant to be seen, and sometimes, it's what should have stayed unseen. 7. Symptoms, 1,974. Silence isn't peace. It's pressure before collapse. Symptoms tells the story of a woman retreating to an isolated English countryside house, where whispers, memories, and unseen presences unravel her mind. It was the UK's official selection for the 1,974 Cannes Film Festival, a haunting character study drenched in atmosphere and dread. Then it vanished. The film was released in a handful of European territories before rights issues and distribution neglect led it into complete obscurity. For decades, it was considered lost. Horror scholars spoke of it in reverent tones. Only poor quality screenshots and anecdotes survived. In 2016, a 35mm print was recovered from Belgium, and the film was finally restored and released 42 years after completion. What's striking isn't just how easily the film disappeared, but how quietly. No scandal, no lawsuit, just silence, like the one inside its protagonist. When a story dissolves into fog, sometimes it's because no one was listening. 8. The Keep, 1,983. The Lost Cut. Walls were built to keep evil out. This one was built to keep it in. Directed by Michael Mann, The Keep is a World War II supernatural horror film with mesmerizing visuals and an ominous electronic score by Tangerine Dream. It follows Nazi soldiers occupying an ancient Romanian fortress only to awaken a dormant, malevolent force sealed within. The film that hit theaters in 1983 ran just 96 minutes, but it wasn't the movie Mann had made. The original cut was reportedly over 3 hours, a sprawling surrealist epic that combined cosmic horror with tragic human obsession. A studio-mandated re-edit hacked it down brutally after Mann's editor died during post-production. That longer version, never officially screened, has become legend. Lost reels, missing effects. A narrative that once made sense now feels fractured. Even the director has disowned the theatrical cut. Bootleg scripts and interviews hint at a masterpiece. What we have feels like a ghost of what could have been. Sometimes, what haunts you isn't the monster, but the missing pieces of its story. 9. Don't Go to Sleep, 1982. It aired once and terrified an entire generation. A family moves into a new home, grieving the loss of their eldest daughter. But as the days pass, the surviving daughter begins seeing her sister's ghost, and the ghost isn't at peace. Don't Go to Sleep is one of the most memorable horror TV movies of the early 80 seconds, for those lucky or unlucky enough to catch it during its only broadcast. The film didn't rely on gore. It used mood, tension, and shocking psychological moments to burn itself into childhood memories. So why did it vanish? No official release was ever made. Rights issues, network changes, and apathy toward archiving made it one of the most elusive films of its kind. For decades, its existence became something of a collective fever dream until low-quality VHS recordings began resurfacing online. Even now, it's not available in high definition, and many still doubt the film's more disturbing moments were real or childhood exaggeration. But the screams, they're not easy to misremember. Sometimes, the horror you can't find is the one that stays with you the longest. 10. Dark August, 1976. He ran from a curse, but it followed in shadows. Dark August is a slow-burn, supernatural tale about a man who accidentally kills a young girl in a rural town and is then stalked by a grieving occultist. The atmosphere is thick with heat, guilt, and something unseen creeping through the forest. Shot in Vermont and completed on a shoestring budget, the film saw a brief release before being lost in distribution chaos. The indie studio went under, the rights were unclear, and the film fell into limbo. For years, Dark August survived only through pirated VHS copies, grainy, flickering, haunted in their own way. Then, decades later, a 16mm print resurfaced and was restored by a boutique horror label, finally giving the film its eerie justice. What's most unnerving isn't the film itself, it's the way it felt fated to disappear. Like the story it tells, something was always trying to erase it. When the woods hide your guilt, sometimes they bury your story too. 11. The Intruder Within, 1981. It surfaced once, then sank without a trace. The Intruder Within is a made-for-TV horror movie that aired only a single time, then was never released again in any format. Set on an offshore oil rig in the Arctic, the film centers around a crew that accidentally unearths a prehistoric creature buried deep within the ice. As the creature grows, so does the paranoia and the isolation. Atmospherically cold and narratively claustrophobic, the film drew comparisons to Alien and The Thing, but with a leaner, more psychological slant. It featured strong performances, eerie practical effects, and an uncanny sense of dread that bled through the screen. And then, it vanished. No official VHS, no DVD, no streaming. Only a handful of VHS recordings taped from that one broadcast remain, circulating in low-resolution circles of horror collectors. The reason? Licensing purgatory. The production company dissolved shortly after the broadcast, and no one acquired distribution rights. Sometimes a film disappears not because it failed, but because no one stayed behind to protect it. What happens when the monster isn't in the film, but in the contracts? 12. Night Warning, 1982. Also released as Butcher, Baker, Nightmare Maker. She wasn't protecting him, she was keeping him. This film was completed, released under multiple titles, and then almost buried by confusion and cultural discomfort. Night Warning follows Billy, a teenage boy raised by his overly possessive aunt, played with manic intensity by Susan Terrell. As the boy begins to unravel her secrets, the line between family, control, and psychosis fractures. Despite its disturbing atmosphere, the film received minimal promotion. Why? In the early 80 seconds, studios were reluctant to distribute horror that dealt openly with repressed sexuality, incestuous undertones, and gay identity. The film was retitled multiple times, edited, and quietly dumped into limited release, effectively ensuring its disappearance from the mainstream. Only years later did cult horror fans resurrect it, praising its boldness, its uncomfortable performances, and its atmosphere of domestic dread. Today, it's hailed as a queer horror classic, but its original full release never truly happened. When a film exposes the horror inside the home, sometimes the world just isn't ready to watch. 13. The Severed Arm, 1973. The cave-in should have killed them. Instead, it made them monsters. In The Severed Arm, a group of men, trapped in a cave-in, draw straws to amputate one man's arm to survive. Years later, they're being hunted one by a killer wielding a severed limb. It's a chilling premise. But the real horror is how the original cut of the film was lost. The theatrical version, released in the US, is missing its opening reel. That reel, according to crew accounts, provided critical psychological context, flashbacks, hallucinations, and the character's guilt manifesting before the murders begin. Without it, the film plays more like a straightforward slasher than the mind-bending descent into trauma it was meant to be. For decades, fans speculated whether the reel had been destroyed, stolen, or simply misplaced. Bootleg versions claim to restore it, but no official release includes it. What remains is a fractured film, both literally and narratively. When the first reel goes missing, sometimes so does the soul of the story. 14. A Reflection of Fear, 1973. She lives in a mansion of whispers. Her mirror doesn't reflect truth, it hides it. A Reflection of Fear is a gothic psychological horror that was completed in 1971, but only saw limited release 2 years later, and not in the way its creators intended. The film follows a reclusive teenage girl named Marguerite who lives with her overbearing mother and spends most of her time whispering to dolls and speaking to reflections. When her estranged father visits, a slow spiral into incestuous tension, psychological collapse, and murder begins. But the version released to the public wasn't the full story. A different, darker cut, reportedly more surreal and explicit, was completed but then abruptly shelved. No one knows why. Rumors say it was deemed too disturbing for audiences. Others claim it challenged the studio's moral threshold. Even in its edited form, A Reflection of Fear is deeply unsettling, shot like a hazy dream where nothing feels grounded. Sandy Dennis's performance is unnervingly delicate, and Robert Shaw's presence only adds weight to the sense of dread. But the real horror lies in what we haven't seen, the lost version, locked away somewhere in studio archives. When a film withholds its darkest self, what does that say about what made it? 15. The Astrologer, 1975. It begins with a star chart and ends in a void. The Astrologer is not to be confused with the other film of the same name from the same year. This one is a cosmic oddity wrapped in mysticism, ego, and inexplicable filmmaking choices. Directed, written, and starred by Craig Denny, the film follows a self-proclaimed psychic who rises to fame, wealth, and madness through astrological manipulation. But it's not the plot that haunts viewers, it's everything around it. The film was completed in 1975. It even had a brief theatrical screening, but shortly after, it disappeared. For decades, no prints were available. The reason? An almost unbelievable oversight. Denny had used copyrighted music from the Moody Blues and other major artists without permission. Legal nightmare followed, and the film was shelved, sealed in silence. For years, The Astrologer existed only as rumor. But in 2011, a lone 35mm print surfaced at the Academy Film Archive. It had been sitting in a vault, untouched. When it was screened publicly for the first time in decades, audiences were left stunned, not by horror, but by surreal brilliance. It was part narcissistic fever dream, part outsider art, part psychological meltdown, all wrapped in glittering 70 seconds haze. What remains is not just a film, but a time capsule of unfiltered delusion, one that was perhaps meant to be forgotten. Sometimes, when a man makes a movie to worship himself, the universe makes sure no one sees it. Bonus pick: The Curse of the Blue Lights, 1988. Before we wrap, here's one more horror film you need to add to your list. It begins like a midnight campfire tale. In the small town of Junction City, Colorado, a group of teenagers stumble upon a decaying corpse glowing with eerie blue light. What follows is a descent into ancient evils, mutated monsters, and a long-buried terror beneath the ground. The Curse of the Blue Lights was a regional horror film, shot on a shoestring budget and completed in 1988. Despite being fully finished with creature effects, practical gore, and a full narrative arc, the film was never widely released. The reason? No distributor wanted to gamble on a local production without stars, name recognition, or polish. It sat on VHS shelves in a few small-town video stores, and then was gone. For decades, Blue Lights became the stuff of urban legend. Many who remembered seeing it as children wondered if it had even existed. No digital copies, no DVD, no streaming, just rumors and fading tape labels. It wasn't until boutique label Vinegar Syndrome unearthed and restored the original reels that the film resurfaced, decades later. Watching it now is like peering into a parallel timeline, one where regional horror had the chance to thrive, raw and unfiltered. The film is messy, sure, but it's also full of heart, genuine ambition, and Lovecraftian imagery that's far more haunting than its budget should allow. Some films aren't polished, they're unearthed, and this one still glows, even in the dark. Some films fade from memory, others are erased on purpose. If you've made it this far, you're one of the few who dares to peer into the vaults that were meant to stay sealed. And there's more, much more lurking in the forgotten corners of horror cinema. If stories like these haunt your curiosity, consider joining us again, because the deeper we dig, the darker it gets, and not everything buried stays dead.